Chapter 1. Before Los Angeles was Los Angeles. Before there was a city called Los Angeles. Before streets were numbered and hills were carved into plots of land. This place already had names, stories, and rhythms. The land was not empty. It was known, used, sung to, and remembered. For thousands of years, the coastline, valleys, rivers, and mountains of Southern California were home to people who understood this landscape, not as property, but as a living system. Long before the first European ship appeared on the horizon, the Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam peoples shaped a world that was deeply rooted in balance, movement, and meaning. The Tongva lived across what would one day become the heart of Los Angeles. Their villages stretched from the Pacific coast to the inland valleys, from the Channel Islands to the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. To the west and north, the Chumash controlled one of the most sophisticated maritime cultures in North America, thriving along the coast and islands with an expertise in ocean travel that astonished later outsiders. Inland, in the canyons and highlands, the Tatavayam lived between the desert and the sea, adapting to a harsher environment through intimate knowledge of water, plants, and seasonal change. Life here followed the land. Rivers like the Los Angeles River, once wide and unpredictable, shifted with the seasons. Oaks dropped acorns that became a staple food. The ocean offered fish, shellfish, and kelp, while the hills provided seeds, roots, and game. Villages were placed carefully, often near fresh water and trade routes, and were not permanent scars on the land. Homes were built to breathe, to be repaired, to disappear without destroying what surrounded them. Trade connected these communities across vast distances. Shell beads made from abalone and other shells moved inland, becoming a form of currency and status. Obsidian from distant volcanic regions found its way to the coast. Stories, songs, and marriages traveled along these same routes, weaving a network that stretched far beyond any single village. Southern California was not isolated. It was connected, dynamic, and socially complex. Spiritual life was inseparable from the physical world. Mountains were not obstacles, but sacred presences. Animals were teachers and messengers. The land itself was alive with memory. Creation stories explained not only how the world came to be, but how people were meant to live within it. These beliefs were not abstract philosophies. They governed daily behavior, from hunting practices to conflict resolution, from ceremonies to child-rearing. The Chumash, in particular, developed a remarkable seafaring tradition. Using plank canoes known as tomals, they navigated the open ocean to the Channel Islands with precision and confidence. These boats were not just tools. They were symbols of cooperation and spiritual discipline, built through collective effort and ritual. From the islands, they harvested resources unavailable on the mainland, strengthening their economic and cultural influence along the coast. Time moved differently in this world. There was no race to expand endlessly, no pressure to extract more than the land could give. Growth was measured in continuity, not domination. Knowledge passed orally from generation to generation, encoded in stories that carried practical survival skills alongside moral lessons. Memory was not written, but it was strong. Yet this balance was fragile, not because it was weak, but because it depended on respect, and respect would soon collide with an entirely different worldview. In the late 18th century, ships began to appear offshore, silent at first, then unmistakably foreign. The people watching from the beaches had no frame of reference for what was coming. These newcomers did not see a living system. They saw territory. They did not see villages and trade networks. They saw souls to convert and land to claim. The land that had sustained life for thousands of years was about to be redefined by distant empires that had never set foot on it. Disease arrived before permanent settlement, spreading invisibly along trade routes. Populations declined before battles were ever fought. By the time soldiers and missionaries marched inland, entire communities were already weakened. The spiritual explanations that had guided life for generations struggled to make sense of suffering brought by forces beyond comprehension. What followed was not a single moment of conquest, but a slow, grinding transformation. Sacred sites were renamed, rivers were redirected, people were relocated, renamed, and reclassified. A landscape once understood through memory and story began to be mapped, measured, and divided. The old world did not vanish overnight. It was pressed, reshaped, and pushed to the margins, surviving in fragments. Songs remembered, names whispered, practices adapted. Even as new flags were raised and new languages spoken, the land itself retained traces of its first caretakers. The paths that became roads often followed ancient trails. The places chosen for settlement echoed older logic about water, shelter, and movement. Los Angeles would later sell itself as a city of reinvention, a place where anyone could arrive and become someone new. But that idea did not begin with Hollywood or migration from the East. It began much earlier, with societies that understood change as part of survival, but never imagined erasure as progress. As the 18th century drew to a close, the age of empires reached the shores of Southern California. Spain, driven by faith and control, would soon attempt to reorder this land through missions and military force. The world of the Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam stood at the edge of an irreversible shift. The land remained, but the rules were about to change. And with the arrival of Spain, the story of Los Angeles would enter its first chapter of conquest, belief, and power, one that would reshape everything that came before and everything that would follow. Chapter 2. Spain arrives. When the Spanish finally stepped onto the soil of Southern California, they did not arrive as curious guests. They arrived with a plan already written. In their minds, this land was not a living system shaped by generations of care, but a frontier waiting to be claimed for God and empire. What they encountered was a world they neither fully understood nor intended to preserve. In 1769, Spanish soldiers and Franciscan missionaries began their northward push into Alta California. Their goal was simple and ambitious at once: to secure the territory against rival European powers and to transform its indigenous inhabitants into loyal subjects of the Spanish crown. Faith was the language they spoke, but control was the outcome they pursued. The mission system would become their primary tool. Missions were not just churches. They were engines of empire. Built along the coast at regular intervals, each mission marked a claim on land and people alike. Indigenous communities were drawn in, or forced in, through a combination of persuasion, pressure, and outright coercion. Once baptized, Native people were no longer considered free to leave. Their labor, their time, and often their bodies were now controlled by the mission. Daily life inside the missions followed a strict routine. Bells dictated when people woke, worked, prayed, and slept. Men labored in fields, workshops, and construction. Women cooked, sewed, cleaned, and were often confined to guarded quarters at night. Traditional practices were discouraged or punished. Native languages were replaced with Spanish. Old beliefs were labeled sinful. What had once been a culture passed through stories and ceremonies was slowly broken apart and replaced with obedience. Disease moved faster than doctrine. Measles, smallpox, and influenza spread through mission populations with devastating effect. Entire villages vanished within years. The Spanish often interpreted this as divine will, while indigenous survivors struggled to understand why their world was collapsing so quickly. The missions, meant to save souls, became places of death on a massive scale. Yet the Spanish believed they were building permanence. Roads were laid, fields cultivated, cattle herded across land that had never seen hooves before. Ranching transformed the landscape, compacting soil and altering ecosystems that had once supported delicate balances. The California coast began to change, not just culturally, but physically. In 1781, 11 years after the first mission was founded in the region, Spain established a civilian settlement near the Los Angeles River. It was named El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles, a long, reverent title for a place that began as a struggling outpost. The settlers, farmers, soldiers, and families of mixed ancestry were tasked with supplying food to nearby missions and military posts. This was not yet a city of dreams. It was dusty, isolated, and vulnerable. The Pueblo survived through persistence rather than prosperity. Floods regularly destroyed crops and buildings. The river shifted unpredictably. Supplies were scarce, and distance from the centers of Spanish power meant that local leaders often had to improvise. Indigenous labor remained essential. Despite laws claiming to protect native people, their exploitation continued quietly and consistently. Over time, the mission system tightened its grip. Generations were born within mission walls, knowing little of life beyond them. Resistance existed, escapes, uprising, refusal. But the imbalance of power was overwhelming. Soldiers enforced order. Punishments were severe. The Spanish worldview left little room for coexistence. It demanded transformation. And yet, beneath the imposed structure, fragments of the old world endured. Songs were remembered. Knowledge of plants and seasons survived in the whispers and habit. The land itself resisted complete control. Droughts, floods, and distance weakened Spanish authority, revealing how fragile empire could be at the edge of the world. By the early 19th century, Spain's grip on California began to loosen. The empire was stretched thin, weakened by wars and unrest across the Atlantic. The missions, once symbols of expansion, became burdens to maintain. Soldiers went unpaid. Supplies dwindled. The promise of order gave way to neglect. In Los Angeles, the Pueblo remained small, but it was changing. Families established roots. Trade increased modestly. A local identity began to form, shaped by Spanish law, Catholic ritual, and the quiet persistence of indigenous presence beneath it all. The city that would one day dominate Southern California was still barely visible, but its foundations were being set, unevenly, imperfectly, and at great cost. In 1821, Spain's rule over California came to an end. Mexico won its independence, and with it, Los Angeles and the surrounding region entered a new chapter. The missions would soon be secularized, their power dismantled, their lands redistributed. But the damage done to people, culture, and memory could not be undone. The Spanish had arrived speaking of salvation and order. What they left behind was a land transformed by force, a population reshaped by loss, and a settlement that stood at the crossroads of empires. As Los Angeles moved from Spanish hands into Mexican control, The city carried with it the scars of its first colonization and the quiet resilience of those who had survived it. The rules of the world had changed once. They were about to change again. Chapter 3: Mexican Los Angeles. When the Spanish flag was lowered and Mexico claimed independence in 1821, Los Angeles did not celebrate with fireworks or fanfare. News traveled slowly to this distant frontier, and when it arrived, it brought uncertainty more than excitement. One empire had fallen, but what would replace it was still unclear. For the people living in the pueblo of Los Angeles, life continued much as before. Dusty streets, modest homes, and a river that still refused to be controlled. Mexico inherited a province that Spain had never fully mastered. Alta California was vast, sparsely populated, and expensive to govern. The mission system, already weakened, stood as a reminder of Spanish authority and excess. The new Mexican government, suspicious of the church's power, moved to dismantle it. Missions were secularized, their lands broken up and redistributed. In theory, indigenous people were supposed to receive parcels of land. In reality, most of it flowed into the hands of a small group of Californio families, descendants of Spanish settlers who now became the region's elite. Thus began the age of the ranchos. Huge land grants, sometimes stretching for tens of thousands of acres, reshaped Southern California. These ranchos were not marked by fences or neat boundaries, but by natural landmarks: hills, streams, groves of trees. Cattle roamed freely across the landscape, multiplying rapidly. Hides and tallow became the backbone of the local economy, traded with foreign merchants who arrived by ship along the coast. Los Angeles transformed into a ranching hub, its fortunes tied to livestock rather than crops. The city itself remained small, but its social structure hardened. Power rested with a handful of families who controlled land, politics, and justice. Life revolved around personal loyalty, family ties, and reputation. Celebrations were grand, hospitality was expected, and honor mattered deeply. Beneath this surface, however, inequality persisted. Indigenous labor continued to support the rancho economy, often under conditions little better than those of the mission era. Their dispossession was complete, even if the language of control had softened. Los Angeles in this period was not yet a place of ambition drawing outsiders in. It was a backwater, far from Mexico City, loosely governed and largely left to manage itself. Local leaders rose and fell through shifting alliances, revolts, and counter-revolts. Governors were overthrown with alarming regularity. Authority was personal, unstable, and often contested. Foreigners began to appear more frequently. Traders from the United States, Britain, and other nations. They brought manufactured goods, new ideas, and quiet influence. American merchants in particular saw opportunity in California's isolation. They married into California families, learned Spanish customs, and waited patiently. Their presence was tolerated, sometimes welcomed, but rarely feared, at least at first. The pueblo of Los Angeles developed a reputation as a rough, unruly place. Fights were common. Justice was swift and public. The city earned the nickname the toughest town west of Santa Fe. It was not lawless, but it was personal. Power came from land, family, and the willingness to enforce one's will. Despite its remoteness, Los Angeles was no longer invisible. Rumors spread of California's fertile land and mild climate. In the United States, the idea of westward expansion hardened into belief. The doctrine of manifest destiny, the conviction that Americans were destined to spread across the continent, began to point unmistakably toward California. Mexico, young and unstable, struggled to defend its distant northern territory. It lacked soldiers, money, and infrastructure. Local Californios governed largely on their own terms, unaware of how exposed they truly were. The rancho system, built on land abundance and limited oversight, appeared strong, but it depended on isolation. And isolation was ending. By the 1840s, tensions grew. American settlers increased in number. Political unrest in Mexico weakened central authority further. When war broke out between Mexico and the United States in 1846, California became a target almost immediately. Resistance was brief and fragmented. Los Angeles changed hands more than once during the conflict, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. For the Californio elite, the war was not just a military defeat, it was the end of an era. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 officially transferred California to the United States. On paper, land rights were supposed to be respected. In practice, the legal system that followed would dismantle the rancho world piece by piece. English replaced Spanish in courts. New laws demanded proof of ownership that many landholders could not provide. Taxes, legal fees, and fraud did the rest. Los Angeles stood again at a turning point. The ranchos still stretched across the hills, cattle still grazed the plains, and the old families still held their gatherings. But the rules had changed. A new power had arrived from the east, bringing courts instead of revolutions, paperwork instead of promises, and a hunger for land that dwarfed anything that had come before. The dusty frontier town was about to be pulled into a far larger story, one driven by American expansion, law, and ambition. And with that shift, Los Angeles would begin its transformation from a remote pueblo into something far more powerful, chaotic, and consequential than anyone living there could yet imagine. Chapter 4. The American Takeover. When the smoke of war cleared and the treaties were signed, Los Angeles woke up under a new flag. There were no dramatic ceremonies in the streets, no sweeping declarations of a new beginning. The transition was quieter than expected, and far more destructive because of it. In 1848, California became part of the United States, and with that shift, Los Angeles entered an era defined not by sudden violence, but by paperwork, courts, and a system that rewarded those who understood it first. On paper, the change seemed generous. The treaty that ended the Mexican-American War promised protection. California landowners were assured that their property rights would be respected. Their culture, language, and traditions were not explicitly outlawed. To many local families, it appeared that life might continue with only minor adjustments. But the new American order did not rely on conquest alone. It relied on law, and law proved far more effective. American courts replaced Mexican ones almost overnight. Spanish-language documents were suddenly suspect. Land grants that had been honored for decades were now questioned, challenged, and delayed. Rancheros were required to prove ownership under unfamiliar legal standards, often in a language they did not speak, before judges who did not understand their history. Legal battles dragged on for years, draining fortunes in fees and taxes. Even when landowners won their cases, the cost of winning often ruined them. Speculators saw opportunity where others saw confusion. American lawyers, surveyors, and investors moved in quickly. They offered loans to struggling rancheros, knowing repayment would be impossible. They bought land at fractions of its value from families desperate to hold on to something, anything. Deception was common. Forged documents circulated freely. Boundaries were redrawn. What had once been a landscape defined by memory and mutual recognition was reduced to lines on maps drawn by strangers. Los Angeles itself began to change character. The pueblo grew as Americans arrived from the east, bringing capital, ambition, and a belief that the city was theirs to reshape. English replaced Spanish in business and government. Protestant churches appeared alongside Catholic ones. New businesses opened: hotels, saloons, stores catering to travelers and traders. The city was no longer a quiet frontier town. It was becoming a contested space. Violence lingered beneath the surface. Crime increased as the social order fractured. Vigilante justice filled gaps where official authority struggled to keep pace. Lynchings were not uncommon. The city gained a reputation for danger, reinforcing the idea that American control was not just desirable, but necessary. Law enforcement expanded, not always to protect everyone equally, but to impose order according to new priorities. Indigenous people, already pushed to the margins, suffered further under American rule. Protections that had existed, however weakly, under Mexican law, disappeared. Forced labor, displacement, and outright massacres occurred across California, often ignored or excused. The state's rapid transformation left little room for those deemed obstacles to progress. Yet prosperity was beginning to flicker. The gold rush, sparked in the same year California joined the United States, sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. Though gold lay far to the north, the city benefited indirectly. Supplies, cattle, and goods flowed through Southern California. Population increased. Money circulated. Los Angeles became a place people passed through and sometimes stayed. The old California families watched as their world narrowed. Their land vanished piece by piece. Their political influence faded. Their children adapted, some learning English and American law, others retreating into nostalgia for a past that could not return. The Rancho era ended not with a battle, but with exhaustion. American ambition filled the vacuum. Entrepreneurs looked at the land and saw potential beyond cattle. Railroads were discussed. Real estate speculation began in earnest. The city's location, near the ocean, blessed with mild weather, sparked ideas of growth that far exceeded anything imagined before. Los Angeles was no longer isolated. It was being pulled into a national economy driven by expansion and profit. The transformation was uneven and uneasy. Old adobe homes stood beside new wooden structures. Spanish street names coexisted with English signs. The city felt divided between eras, unsure of its identity. But the direction was clear. The future belonged to those who could navigate American systems of law, money, and power. By the late 19th century, Los Angeles was poised on the edge of a boom it did not yet fully understand. Its population was still modest, its streets still rough, but the foundations were being laid. Water, transportation, and capital would soon determine its fate. The struggle for land had been won. The struggle to control growth was just beginning. As Los Angeles adjusted to its new rulers, another question loomed quietly in the background, one that would define the city's next transformation. How could a place with limited natural water sustain the ambitions now being projected onto it? The answer would reshape Southern California forever, and it would begin not with gold or cattle, but with a single, dangerous idea: that geography itself could be conquered. Chapter 5: How Los Angeles Cheated Geography. Los Angeles had land, sunshine, and ambition, but it did not have water. That fact, more than any other, threatened to place a hard limit on the city's future. By the late 19th century, as American capital and population trickled in, it became increasingly clear that the natural environment of Southern California could not support the growth its boosters envisioned. Rain was scarce. Rivers were seasonal. The Los Angeles River, once wild and shifting, could not sustain a major metropolis. Geography had drawn a boundary. Los Angeles decided to erase it. In the early days, the city survived on wells and small irrigation systems. For a time, it was enough. But as population grew and land speculation intensified, the math no longer worked. The city faced a choice: accept its limits or reach far beyond them. It chose the latter. The solution was audacious and, to many, unthinkable. Hundreds of miles to the northeast lay the Owens Valley, a high desert region fed by snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada. Its rivers were cold, steady, and abundant. Everything Los Angeles lacked. Engineers and city leaders began to look at the valley not as a distant community, but as a reservoir waiting to be claimed. The plan required secrecy. If the residents of the Owens Valley knew what Los Angeles intended, they would resist. If competing cities realized what was happening, they might intervene. So Los Angeles moved quietly. Agents were sent to buy land and water rights under false pretenses. Local farmers were told the purchases were for small irrigation projects or private use. Few understood that they were signing away the lifeblood of their region. At the center of this effort was a new kind of power broker, the engineer. Men like William Mulholland, an Irish immigrant with no formal education but extraordinary technical skill, became heroes of the city. Mulholland believed deeply in Los Angeles' destiny. To him, water was not just a resource. It was the key to unlocking the city's future. Engineering would triumph where nature refused. Construction of the aqueduct began in 1908. It was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in American history. Crews blasted tunnels through mountains, built siphons across valleys, and laid concrete channels across harsh desert terrain. Thousands of workers labored in brutal conditions. Accidents were common. Deaths were accepted as part of progress. In 1913, water from the Owens Valley reached Los Angeles. When Mulholland opened the aqueduct, he spoke simply, "There it is. Take it." The phrase captured the city's philosophy perfectly. Water had been taken, and with it, the future. The impact was immediate. Land values soared. Developers rushed in. Los Angeles began to sprawl outward, no longer constrained by its natural supply. Neighborhoods that had once been impossible suddenly became viable. The city marketed itself aggressively, selling a vision of endless growth, green lawns, and suburban comfort. Few newcomers questioned where the water came from. The Owens Valley paid the price. As water was diverted south, rivers dried up. Farms failed. Dust storms swept across land that had once been fertile. Residents protested, sabotaged aqueduct infrastructure, and appealed to the courts. Their efforts failed. Los Angeles was bigger, richer, and more powerful. The law, once again, favored those who understood how to use it. This was not an isolated act. It was a model. Los Angeles learned that growth could be engineered, that political influence could reshape geography itself. The city extended its reach again and again, absorbing surrounding communities, consolidating control, and securing more water through additional projects. Each expansion was framed as progress. Each required someone else to lose. Water transformed Los Angeles into a machine, Engineers became celebrities. Infrastructure became destiny. Nature was no longer something to live within, but something to overcome. Rivers were encased in concrete. Floods were controlled. The city hardened itself against unpredictability, even as it depended entirely on distant systems it did not fully control. This triumph carried a hidden cost. By cheating geography, Los Angeles built a future that required constant maintenance, constant expansion, and constant denial. The city's survival depended on keeping the water flowing, no matter the political, environmental, or moral consequences. Any interruption threatened catastrophe. As the population exploded in the early 20th century, Los Angeles entered a new phase. It was no longer a regional city. It was becoming a national symbol of possibility. But beneath the optimism lay a fragile truth. The city was living on borrowed water, borrowed land, and borrowed time. The success of the aqueduct emboldened Los Angeles's leaders. If water could be taken from hundreds of miles away, what else could be claimed? Railroads soon followed. Industry expanded. Oil was discovered beneath the city itself, adding another layer of wealth and complexity. Los Angeles began to boom, not slowly, not cautiously, but violently and unevenly. By the time most Americans began paying attention to Southern California, the transformation was already underway. The city that had once struggled to survive now seemed unstoppable. Its growth looked natural, inevitable. But it was neither. It was the result of decisions made behind closed doors, of deals struck quietly, of power exercised without consent. Los Angeles had learned how to bend reality to its will. The consequences of that lesson would ripple through every chapter that followed. With water secured and ambition unleashed, the city was ready for its first true explosion. A boom driven by railroads, oil, and the promise of reinvention. The land had been claimed. The water had been taken. Now Los Angeles would sell itself to the world. Chapter 6. Oil, Railroads, and the First Explosion. With water flowing south through concrete veins, Los Angeles was finally free to grow without restraint. What followed was not gradual development, but ignition. The city entered a period of explosive transformation in which distance collapsed, wealth surged from beneath the ground, and a new identity was carefully manufactured and sold. Los Angeles was no longer waiting to be discovered. It was advertising itself. The first catalyst was steel. When the railroads arrived in the late 19th century, Los Angeles was pulled abruptly into the national bloodstream. What had once been an isolated outpost became reachable, measurable, and profitable. Rail lines connected Southern California to the Midwest and the East Coast, slashing travel times and shipping costs. Oranges could now reach Chicago. People could reach Los Angeles without months of hardship. The city was open for business. Railroad companies did more than transport goods and passengers. They marketed a vision. Pamphlets flooded the country, promising health, sunshine, and second chances. Los Angeles was portrayed as a place where winter did not exist, where opportunity grew as easily as citrus trees, where life could be restarted without the weight of the past. This was not accidental exaggeration. It was a strategy. The population responded. Farmers fleeing drought, laborers escaping industrial cities, retirees seeking mild weather, all arrived with expectations shaped by brochures and stories. Los Angeles began to swell. Neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. Land that had been worthless a decade earlier became valuable simply because it existed within reach of rail lines and water. Then came oil. At the turn of the 20th century, drillers struck black wealth beneath the city itself. Oil derricks rose among homes, schools, and churches. The smell of petroleum filled the air. Fields erupted across Los Angeles and its surrounding areas, transforming quiet land into industrial zones. Fortunes were made quickly and unevenly. Speculators arrived in waves. The city's economy shifted from agricultural promise to industrial power. Oil did more than create wealth. It reinforced the idea that Los Angeles was blessed, destined, different. Riches were not only imported or engineered, they lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for those bold enough to extract them. The city absorbed this belief into its identity. Reinvention was no longer just possible. It was expected. Growth fed on itself. More people required more housing. More housing required more land. More land required more infrastructure. Developers carved neighborhoods into grids, often with little planning or coordination. Streetcar lines extended outward, allowing people to live farther from work. The city did not grow upward. It spread outward, endlessly. This sprawl created a new kind of urban life, one less dense, less communal, more private. Los Angeles began to feel less like a traditional city and more like a collection of promises stitched together by roads and rails. Each neighborhood sold a slightly different version of the dream: health, wealth, escape, respectability. Behind the optimism, inequality deepened. Workers lived near oil fields and factories. Wealthier residents settled farther away, buffered by distance. Racial and economic boundaries hardened, often enforced through informal agreements and outright exclusion. The city was expanding, but it was not expanding equally. Still, the myth held. Los Angeles marketed itself relentlessly. Climate became currency. Sunshine was framed as medicine. Opportunity was framed as moral reward. If success did not come, the implication was personal failure, not structural design. The city promised freedom from history while quietly constructing a new hierarchy. By the early 20th century, Los Angeles had become one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. Its boosters spoke of destiny. Its newspapers celebrated progress. Its leaders believed growth itself was proof of righteousness. Few questioned whether the foundation could support what was being built upon it. The land bore the strain. Oil fields scarred neighborhoods. Rail yards cut through communities. Rivers were further controlled and contained. Nature was no longer an influence to respect. It was an obstacle to manage. The city moved faster than its ability to reflect. And yet, something else was forming. Something less tangible, but far more powerful. Los Angeles was learning how to sell illusion. The railroad brochures had been only the beginning. Soon, an entire industry would rise dedicated to manufacturing dreams, images, and stories that could travel farther and faster than steel ever could. The city's reinvention was not complete, but its trajectory was set. Oil and railroads had delivered wealth and access. Water had erased limits. Population had followed belief. Los Angeles had exploded into existence not as a finished place, but as a promise, one that would soon be projected onto screens around the world. As the boom accelerated, a new kind of industry began quietly taking root on the city's outskirts. Drawn by light, land, and the freedom to operate far from Eastern control, storytellers and entrepreneurs arrived with cameras instead of drills. They would soon transform Los Angeles into something no city had ever been before. The age of boom had prepared the ground. The age of myth was about to begin. Chapter 7. Hollywood is born. By the time cameras arrived in Southern California, Los Angeles already understood illusion. It had sold sunshine as medicine, land as destiny, and growth as virtue. Film was not a foreign idea here. It was a natural extension of what the city had been practicing for decades. Hollywood did not create the myth of Los Angeles. Los Angeles created Hollywood because it needed a machine capable of turning belief into reality. In the early years of motion pictures, the industry was centered thousands of miles away in New York and Chicago. Films were short, crude, and tightly controlled. Patents dictated who could use cameras, who could process film, and who could profit. For independent filmmakers, the system was suffocating. Southern California offered escape. The light was brighter and more reliable. The land was cheap. Local authorities were less interested in regulation. And if patent lawyers came looking, the Mexican border was close. Producers arrived quietly at first, filming in open fields, on ranch land, and along dusty roads. Los Angeles could pass for almost anywhere. With a few props and the right angle, it became the Old West, ancient Rome, or a distant kingdom. The city's geography was endlessly adaptable, and its lack of established identity became its greatest strength. Hollywood, then a small community northwest of downtown, offered space to build something permanent. Studios bought land, erected sound stages, and began to industrialize storytelling. What had started as experimentation hardened into system. Films were no longer novelties. They became products, carefully manufactured and distributed. This new industry reshaped the city. Actors, writers, directors, and technicians poured in, chasing opportunity and reinvention. Some succeeded spectacularly. Most did not. But the belief that anyone could become someone here was reinforced with every success story. Hollywood fed the myth, and the myth fed Hollywood. The studios understood power. They controlled contracts, images, and narratives. Actors were remade, names changed, accents erased, backgrounds rewritten. The screen did not reflect reality. It replaced it. America, as seen by the world, became filtered through Los Angeles imagination. Small-town values, heroic individuals, moral clarity, all projected from a city built on complexity and contradiction. Hollywood sold simplicity, good versus evil. Success rewarded virtue. Failure punished weakness. These stories traveled globally, shaping how people imagined not just Los Angeles, but the United States itself. America became youthful, optimistic, endlessly upward moving. The realities of labor conflict, racial tension, and inequality rarely made the cut. Behind the glamour, the industry was ruthless. Studios crushed unions, controlled wages, and silenced dissent. Careers were made and destroyed at the discretion of executives. Aspiring actors lived precariously, competing for visibility in a system designed to produce stars sparingly. The dream required scarcity to remain valuable. The city adapted around the industry. Neighborhoods grew near studios. Entire economies formed to support production. Costumes, sets, lighting, makeup. Hollywood consumed resources and talent relentlessly. Los Angeles became a company town, except the company sold fantasies instead of steel. At the same time, Hollywood reshaped the city's self-image. Los Angeles stopped thinking of itself as a frontier or boom town. It became a stage. Appearance mattered. Image mattered. Reality was secondary. The city learned to perform itself, to lean into spectacle rather than substance. This performance had consequences. Hollywood promoted ideals of beauty, success, and lifestyle that few could attain. It amplified divisions, privileging whiteness, youth, and wealth, while marginalizing those who did not fit the frame. Stories of indigenous people, immigrants, and the working poor were distorted or erased. The myth required selective memory. Yet Hollywood also gave Los Angeles something no other city possessed: global influence. Images created here shaped fashion, language, behavior, and desire across continents. Los Angeles was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of freedom, excess, reinvention, and possibility. As the film industry matured through the early 20th century, its reach expanded beyond entertainment. Politics, advertising, and culture intertwined with cinematic storytelling. The techniques developed in studios would later be used to sell products, candidates, and wars. Hollywood taught America how to persuade through emotion. Los Angeles thrived on this power. It attracted money, talent, and attention. But it also became increasingly disconnected from its own foundations. The city that sold dreams struggled to confront its realities. Housing shortages grew, inequality deepened. The cost of maintaining the illusion rose steadily. Still, the machine kept running. Hollywood survived scandals, economic crashes, and technological change. Sound replaced silence. Color replaced black and white. Each transformation reinforced the city's central role in shaping modern culture. Los Angeles did not merely adapt to change, it staged it. By the time the world entered the mid-20th century, Los Angeles had become both a place and a projection. People arrived not just to live, but to become something else. Reinvention, once a necessity of survival, became a commodity. But as Hollywood refined its myths, the city beneath them grew restless. Communities excluded from the dream began to push back. The gap between image and experience widened. And as Los Angeles prepared to enter a new era defined by growth, war, and global power, the question lingered quietly beneath the glow of studio lights. What happens when a city believes its own story for too long? The answer would emerge not on screen, but in the streets, where reality, unlike film, could not be edited away. Chapter 8: Race, Segregation, and Power. As Hollywood projected images of freedom, glamour, and endless possibility onto screens around the world, another Los Angeles was taking shape beneath the surface. It was quieter, harder, and governed by rules that rarely appeared in movies. This city was mapped not by dreams, but by borders. Most of them invisible, all of them enforced. The explosion of growth that followed railroads, oil, and film brought people from everywhere. Mexican families who had lived in the region for generations now found themselves treated as outsiders in their own land. Black Americans arrived in increasing numbers, especially during the early waves of the Great Migration, hoping to escape the rigid segregation of the South. Asian immigrants built communities despite exclusion laws and open hostility. Los Angeles marketed itself as open and modern, but belonging was carefully rationed. The new order did not rely on signs or fences. It relied on paperwork. Redlining maps, created by banks and government agencies, quietly divided the city into zones of value and risk. Neighborhoods were graded based on race, not infrastructure. Areas with Mexican, Black, or Asian residents were marked in red, labeled unsafe for investment. Loans were denied. Insurance was withheld. Decay was predicted, then blamed on the people forced to live there. Racial covenants did the rest. Deeds included clauses forbidding the sale or rental of homes to anyone who was not white. These agreements were legal, widespread, and socially enforced. Even when money was available, access was denied. Entire neighborhoods were locked away, preserved as enclaves of privilege. The dream of Los Angeles was built on exclusion, one contract at a time. Communities pushed outward until they could go no further. Mexican neighborhoods clustered east and south of downtown. Black residents were confined largely to Central Avenue and nearby areas. Japanese Americans built thriving communities, only to see them destroyed during World War II internment. Chinese residents were pushed, relocated, and erased repeatedly. Each group adapted, survived, and created culture within the limits imposed upon them. Policing became the mechanism that held these borders in place. The Los Angeles Police Department grew in size, power, and confidence. It framed itself as a force of order, protecting the city from chaos. In practice, it protected certain neighborhoods and controlled others. Surveillance, raids, and aggressive enforcement were concentrated where political power was weakest. The contrast between image and reality widened. Hollywood celebrated freedom while entire communities lived under constant scrutiny. Movies portrayed Los Angeles as open and welcoming, while residents navigated daily restrictions on where they could live, work, or gather. The city learned to live with contradiction, to accept injustice as background noise. Economic opportunity followed the same lines. Jobs in studios, corporate offices, and new industries were often closed to non-white workers. Labor was welcomed, advancement was not. Wealth accumulated in the hills and along the coast, while inner neighborhoods bore the weight of overcrowding and neglect. Infrastructure investments flowed upward and outward, rarely inward. And yet, culture flourished in these constrained spaces. Music, food, language, and identity evolved under pressure. Jazz along Central Avenue rivaled anything in New York. Mexican-American culture blended tradition and resistance. Immigrant communities built informal economies and networks of mutual support. Los Angeles was becoming a global city, not because it was inclusive, but because people refused to disappear. The city's leaders insisted segregation was accidental, the result of market forces rather than design. But the patterns were too consistent, too precise. Growth was encouraged only where it preserved existing hierarchies. When communities resisted displacement or demanded equality, they were labeled dangerous, ungrateful, or radical. By the 1930s and 1940s, Los Angeles had mastered the art of separation without spectacle. Unlike southern cities with explicit segregation laws, LA operated through denial. It claimed progress while practicing control. The borders were real, but unspoken. World War II would briefly disrupt this balance. Defense industries brought jobs and new waves of migration. Housing shortages intensified pressure. The contradictions of Los Angeles grew harder to ignore. People who built planes and ships for the nation returned to neighborhoods still denied investment and respect. The myth, however, endured. Hollywood continued to export images of unity and optimism. The city continued to expand, confident in its narrative. But beneath the promise of paradise, tension accumulated. Each denied loan, Each forced relocation, each violent encounter with police added weight. Los Angeles had become a city divided not by walls, but by rules. And rules, once embedded, resist change fiercely. The stage was set for confrontation, not yet explosive, but inevitable. The borders that shaped the city would soon be tested, not in courtrooms or contracts, but in the streets. The dream was beginning to crack. Chapter 9. The Great Depression. By the time the cracks in Los Angeles became impossible to ignore, the illusion of endless growth collapsed with stunning speed. The stock market crash of 1929 did not arrive in the city with the drama of a single day, but with a slow, grinding realization that the promise had been overstated and the safety nets were thin. The dream that Hollywood had sold so confidently now faced its first true test. And Los Angeles, built on ambition and imbalance, found itself dangerously exposed. Jobs vanished almost overnight. Construction halted, oil fields slowed, studio contracts dried up. Thousands who had come west believing reinvention was guaranteed suddenly found themselves trapped in a city that had no place for them once the money stopped moving. Tent cities appeared along riverbanks and empty lots. The Los Angeles River, already stripped of its wild power, became a refuge for the dispossessed. People slept beneath bridges that symbolized progress they no longer shared. At the same time, another wave arrived. From the Great Plains came families fleeing dust, drought, and foreclosure. The Dust Bowl migrants traveled west in battered cars and overloaded trucks, driven by stories of California abundance that had not yet been updated to reflect reality. They arrived hungry, exhausted, and unwelcome. Los Angeles had sold the dream to too many people, and now it could not absorb them all. Competition for work intensified. Wages dropped. Resentment grew. Longtime residents blamed newcomers. Newcomers blamed the system. The city's carefully managed divisions sharpened into open hostility. Economic collapse stripped away the politeness that had once masked inequality. Crime rose, not because Los Angeles suddenly became immoral, but because survival demanded risk. Petty theft increased. Organized crime expanded. Prohibition, already in effect, created underground economies that thrived in desperation. Smuggling, bootlegging, and corruption flourished. Los Angeles developed a reputation as a city where law bent easily under pressure. In response, authority hardened. The Los Angeles Police Department, already powerful, moved aggressively to assert control. Policing shifted from enforcement to domination. Patrols increased, raids became more frequent. Surveillance expanded. The city's leaders framed disorder as a threat to civilization itself, justifying increasingly militarized tactics. Fear became policy. This new policing philosophy did not apply evenly. Poor neighborhoods and communities of color bore the brunt. Migrants, the unemployed, and the unhoused were treated not as victims of collapse, but as dangers to be contained. Public spaces were cleared. Camps were destroyed. Visibility itself became a crime. Hollywood adjusted but did not stop. Studios leaned into escapism. Musicals, comedies, and glamorous dramas flooded screens, offering audiences relief from hardship. The contrast between fantasy and reality widened further. The city learned how to suffer quietly while projecting joy outward. Behind the scenes, labor unrest simmered. Workers organized. Strikes spread. The promise of individual reinvention gave way to collective demands for dignity. Los Angeles, built on fragmented ambition, struggled to respond to unified resistance. Police and private security forces were deployed to break strikes and intimidate organizers. Violence followed. The city grew darker, not just economically, but psychologically. Optimism faded into suspicion. The confidence that had fueled growth curdled into anxiety. Los Angeles had been designed for expansion, not contraction. When growth stalled, the systems holding it together strained. And yet, the city did not collapse. It adapted through control rather than compassion. Federal relief programs provided limited support. Infrastructure projects created temporary work. Hollywood survived by selling hope more aggressively than ever. Los Angeles endured, but it did not heal. The experience of the Depression left scars. It reinforced distrust between classes and communities. It strengthened institutions of force while weakening those of care. It taught the city that survival could be managed, but at a cost. As the 1930s drew to a close, Los Angeles remained tense, unequal, and unresolved. The borders drawn earlier had hardened under pressure. The myth of paradise persisted, but it now required constant reinforcement. The city was learning how to function under strain, and how quickly it could turn against its own. Relief would not come through reform alone. It would come through mobilization on a scale Los Angeles had never seen. A global conflict was approaching, and when it arrived, it would transform the city once again. Pulling it out of depression not through dreams, but through war, Los Angeles was about to become something else entirely. Chapter 10. World War II. When war arrived, Los Angeles did not hesitate. It did not debate. It mobilized. The same systems that had enforced control during the Depression now redirected themselves toward production. Fear gave way to urgency, and urgency unlocked resources on a scale the city had never experienced. Almost overnight, Los Angeles was transformed from a tense, struggling metropolis into one of the most important industrial centers in the United States. The federal government poured money into Southern California. Defense contracts flowed in by the billions. Aircraft factories rose across the region, vast and humming, employing tens of thousands. Shipyards expanded along the coast. Steel, aluminum, and machinery reshaped the city's economy. Where Hollywood sold dreams, wartime Los Angeles manufactured power. The shift was dramatic. Unemployment vanished. Men and women who had stood in bread lines only years earlier now worked around the clock. Assembly lines replaced uncertainty with routine. Wages rose. The city breathed again. War, brutal and distant, had delivered economic salvation. Los Angeles became essential. Bombers, fighters, and transport planes rolled out of factories day and night. The city's mild climate allowed year-round production, an advantage no eastern rival could match. Geography, once a limitation, now worked in its favor. The same sunlight that had attracted filmmakers fueled non-stop manufacturing. The population surged. Millions arrived from across the country, drawn by jobs and patriotism. Black Americans came in large numbers, escaping Southern segregation for defense work. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, filling roles once closed to them. Immigrants and migrants crowded into hastily built housing. Los Angeles grew faster than it could organize itself. The strain was immediate. Housing shortages worsened. Entire families shared small apartments. Temporary structures appeared wherever space allowed. Neighborhoods already shaped by exclusion absorbed new pressure. Tensions rose as competition for space and resources intensified. At the same time, fear reshaped the city. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were suddenly reclassified as threats. Families who had lived in Los Angeles for decades were forced from their homes and businesses and sent to internment camps. Entire neighborhoods emptied almost overnight. Property was lost, lives were disrupted. The city absorbed this injustice quietly, focused on production and loyalty. War demanded conformity. Dissent was discouraged. Authority expanded. Policing intensified. Surveillance became normalized. The logic of emergency justified nearly anything. Los Angeles learned how easily fear could override rights. Hollywood joined the effort. Studios shifted from escapism to propaganda, producing films that promoted unity, sacrifice, and moral clarity. The city's myth-making machine aligned itself with national purpose. The boundary between entertainment and persuasion blurred further. Despite inequality and injustice, the war reshaped opportunity. Many who had been excluded from prosperity gained footholds they would not easily surrender afterward. Skills were learned. Expectations changed. The idea that Los Angeles could provide stable work, not just illusion, took hold. The city's identity shifted again. It was no longer merely a place of reinvention or spectacle. It was an engine, an arsenal, a crucial node in a global conflict. Power flowed through factories, ports, and rail yards. Los Angeles became indispensable. When the war ended, the machinery did not stop. The infrastructure remained. The population stayed. The defense economy transitioned into permanence. What had been built for emergency became normal. Los Angeles emerged from World War II larger, richer, and more confident than ever before. But the contradictions remained unresolved. Segregation still shaped neighborhoods. Inequality still defined access. The authority structures strengthened during crisis did not relax easily. The city had grown powerful, but not fair. As soldiers returned and families settled, Los Angeles stood on the edge of a new era. It had survived collapse, absorbed millions, and mastered production. The question was no longer whether the city could grow. It was whether it could live with what it had become. The post-war boom loomed ahead, promising comfort, mobility, and modernity. And with it, a radical redesign of the city itself was about to begin. Chapter 11. The Freeway City. When the war ended, Los Angeles did not slow down. It accelerated. The factories that had powered victory gave way to a different kind of machine, one that would reshape the city more permanently than bombs or contracts ever could. The automobile became the organizing principle of life in Southern California, and Los Angeles rebuilt itself around it with breathtaking speed and ruthless efficiency. Cars had already been part of the city's culture before the war, but now they became essential. Millions of returning veterans wanted homes, privacy, and distance from the crowded conditions they had endured during wartime. Developers responded with suburbs, spreading outward in every direction. The promise was simple and irresistible: a house, a lawn, a driveway, and freedom of movement. The city embraced the vision wholeheartedly. To make it work, Los Angeles had to be torn apart. Freeways were planned not as additions, but as replacements. Entire neighborhoods stood in the path of progress, and progress did not negotiate. Homes were condemned. Streets were severed. Communities that had taken generations to build were erased in months. Residents were displaced with little say in the matter. Compensation, when offered, rarely reflected what was lost. The routes chosen were not accidental. Freeways cut most deeply through working-class and minority neighborhoods, areas with the least political power to resist. Black communities, already confined by redlining and covenants, were split apart. Mexican-American neighborhoods were carved up. What had been vibrant local networks became islands separated by concrete and noise. The city justified it as necessity. Cars meant freedom. Freeways meant efficiency. Growth demanded sacrifice. The logic was technical, unemotional, and absolute. Los Angeles did not ask whether there were other ways to design a city. It had committed fully to speed. Streetcar systems that once connected neighborhoods were dismantled. Public transit faded in importance. Walking became impractical. Distance expanded. Daily life reorganized itself around commuting, parking, and traffic. The city spread wider and wider, but grew thinner in spirit. Suburbs multiplied. Shopping centers replaced local markets. Interaction became optional. Los Angeles offered comfort without connection, privacy without community, mobility without belonging. The dream evolved again, now centered on isolation as luxury. For those who could afford it, the system worked beautifully. Freeways delivered access to jobs, beaches, and entertainment. Suburban life felt safe, modern, and controlled. But for those left behind, the costs were constant. Noise, pollution, and disinvestment followed the concrete. The city's divisions became physical, impossible to ignore. Los Angeles became famous for traffic, but traffic was only the symptom. The real transformation was psychological. Time was spent alone, enclosed, moving through space without engaging it. The city ceased to be experienced as a shared environment. It became something passed through. Policing adapted to this new geography. Cars allowed rapid response, surveillance, and pursuit. Authority became mobile. Encounters grew more impersonal and more volatile. The distance between residents and institutions widened, even as enforcement reached further. By the 1960s, the modern Los Angeles landscape was complete. A vast web of freeways stitched together sprawling neighborhoods, industrial zones, and commercial centers. The city had no single heart. It pulsed in fragments. Identity became local, defensive, and fragmented. Hollywood once again helped normalize the change. Films celebrated car chases, open roads, and speed. The automobile was framed as power and escape. The isolation it produced was rarely questioned. Los Angeles became synonymous with motion, even as people felt increasingly disconnected. The costs accumulated quietly. Air quality deteriorated. Communities lost cohesion. Political participation weakened. The city functioned, but it did not cohere. Los Angeles had optimized for movement, not for life. And yet, growth continued. The system was too large, too invested, too profitable to reverse. Freeways became permanent facts. Neighborhoods adjusted or disappeared. The city moved forward without looking back. But beneath the hum of traffic, tension built. The borders drawn earlier, racial, economic, cultural, were now reinforced by concrete. Displacement bred resentment. Isolation bred misunderstanding. The freeway city was efficient, but brittle. Los Angeles had engineered itself into a machine that could not easily feel pain, but could not heal either. The contradictions of paradise had not been resolved. They had been paved over. The next rupture would not come from infrastructure or economics. It would come from people, pushed too far, divided too deeply, and finally unwilling to remain silent. The city was moving fast. It did not yet realize how close it was to stopping altogether. Chapter 12. Watts, Protest, and the shattered illusion. By the early 1960s, Los Angeles looked complete. The freeways were in place, the suburbs stretched to the horizon, and Hollywood continued to export images of confidence and control. From a distance, the city appeared modern, prosperous, and calm. But beneath the concrete and optimism, pressure had been building for years. The freeway city had not erased inequality. It had concentrated it. For Black residents in South Los Angeles, opportunity remained tightly restricted. Jobs in the booming post-war economy were often inaccessible. Housing was confined to narrow corridors shaped by decades of redlining and exclusion. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Political power was distant. The promise of California sunshine did not translate into mobility or security. Policing filled the vacuum left by absent investment. The Los Angeles Police Department, shaped by Depression-era crackdowns and wartime authority, had grown increasingly rigid and aggressive. It viewed certain neighborhoods not as communities to serve, but as territories to control. Patrols were constant. Stops were frequent. Respect was rarely reciprocal. Civil rights movements across the country exposed these contradictions. While the South drew national attention with visible segregation and violent resistance, Los Angeles insisted it was different, more progressive, more enlightened. There were no segregation signs, no Jim Crow laws, and yet the outcomes were strikingly similar. Exclusion operated through policy, policing, and neglect rather than explicit decree. Young people felt it most sharply. Expectations rose while pathways remained blocked. Frustration turned inward, then outward. Each encounter with authority reinforced the sense that the system was designed to contain rather than uplift. In August 1965, that tension ignited. What began as a routine traffic stop in Watts escalated rapidly. Rumors spread, crowds gathered, anger, long suppressed, surged into the open. For 6 days, the neighborhood erupted. Buildings burned, businesses were destroyed, National Guard troops flooded the streets. The city watched itself unravel in real time. The Watts riots were not random chaos. They were the result of accumulated grievances colliding with a spark. Poverty, unemployment, housing discrimination, and police brutality converged into a moment that could no longer be managed quietly. Los Angeles, so practiced at controlling its image, lost control of the narrative. Television carried the scenes across the country. Smoke rose over palm trees. Soldiers patrolled American streets. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The city of dreams appeared suddenly fragile, divided, and violent. The illusion cracked. Officials scrambled to explain what had happened. Some blamed agitators. Others blamed culture. Few accepted responsibility for the conditions that had made the explosion inevitable. Investigations were launched. Reports were written. The language was careful. The conclusions were cautious. Little changed. In the years that followed, activism intensified. Protest movements expanded beyond race to include opposition to war, demands for economic justice, and challenges to authority itself. Los Angeles became a site of confrontation between generations, ideologies, and visions of the future. Police presence increased further. Surveillance expanded. The city responded to unrest by hardening rather than listening. Hollywood watched closely and adapted. Films grew darker, more cynical. The optimism of earlier decades faded into stories of alienation, rebellion, and distrust. Los Angeles began to recognize itself on screen, not as paradise, but as pressure cooker. The Watts uprising marked a turning point. It revealed that the systems holding the city together were brittle. Growth and infrastructure had not produced cohesion. Speed and sprawl had not produced justice. The borders embedded in policy and concrete were now visible through flame. And yet, the city did not collapse. It absorbed the shock and continued forward, carrying unresolved tension with it. Programs were introduced, promises were made, but the underlying structure remained largely intact. Policing stayed central. Economic exclusion persisted. Housing segregation endured. Los Angeles had crossed a threshold. It could no longer convincingly pretend that its problems were accidental or temporary. The city had been exposed, not just to the nation, but to itself. As the decade ended, the optimism that had defined post-war Los Angeles was gone. In its place stood a harder, more complicated city. Still powerful, still expanding, but deeply conflicted. The myth had not vanished, but it now required constant reinforcement to survive. The cracks revealed in Watts would not close. They would widen, shaping the decades to come. The next era would be defined not just by protest, but by fear. Fear of crime, fear of disorder, fear of losing control. Los Angeles had learned how quickly illusion could shatter. It would soon respond by building something stronger, harsher, and far more enduring. Chapter 13. Crime, Fear, and the Rise of the LAPD Empire. The city did not calm after the 1960s. It hardened. The fires of Watts had revealed how fragile Los Angeles really was, and the response was not reconciliation, but reinforcement. Fear became the dominant political force, and crime became the lens through which nearly every problem was viewed. By the early 1970s, Los Angeles was entering an era in which control would be prioritized over trust, and force would be framed as stability. Economic shifts deepened the crisis. Manufacturing jobs declined. Deindustrialization hollowed out neighborhoods that had briefly prospered during the war years. Youth unemployment rose sharply, especially in communities already isolated by freeways and segregation. Opportunity shrank, while frustration grew. In that vacuum, gangs expanded, not as sudden anomalies, but as alternative structures of identity, protection, and income. Drugs intensified everything. Heroin and later crack cocaine moved through Los Angeles with devastating speed. Addiction tore through families. Violence escalated as markets hardened and competition intensified. Entire neighborhoods became synonymous with danger in the public imagination, even as residents navigated daily life with resilience and fear. Los Angeles became a city spoken about in headlines. Crime statistics replaced social context. Nightly news broadcasts looped images of violence, reinforcing the idea that the city was under siege. Fear was no longer localized. It became collective. The Los Angeles Police Department rose to meet this moment with unprecedented confidence. It did not see itself as a municipal force. It saw itself as a barrier between civilization and collapse. Policing shifted from response to prevention, from presence to dominance. Military language entered everyday enforcement. The city was no longer being patrolled. It was being occupied. Leadership mattered. Under Chief Darrell Gates, the LAPD embraced a philosophy that treated crime as war. Specialized units expanded. Tactical gear became routine. Aggressive sweeps and mass arrests were justified as necessary pressure. The line between policing and punishment blurred. Communities already distrustful of authority felt the weight immediately. Stop-and-frisk encounters multiplied. Raids became frequent. Entire neighborhoods were treated as hostile zones. Young men, particularly Black and Latino, grew up expecting confrontation as a normal feature of public space. Each encounter reinforced the sense that the city was not theirs to belong to. The logic of enforcement fed on itself. Heavy policing increased arrests, which justified further policing. Resistance was framed as proof of danger. Abuse was dismissed as necessity. Oversight weakened as fear strengthened authority. Hollywood reflected the moment. Films portrayed Los Angeles as violent, chaotic, and morally ambiguous. Gangs and police became cinematic archetypes. The city's darkness was stylized, then normalized. Fear became entertainment, reinforcing public appetite for control. By the 1980s, the war on drugs accelerated the cycle. Mandatory sentencing filled prisons. Entire generations were lost to incarceration, families fractured. Economic mobility became nearly impossible for those caught in the system. The city paid little attention to long-term consequences. The immediate goal was order. Los Angeles became infamous. Its reputation spread nationally and internationally. Gangs like the Crips and Bloods became symbols of urban decay. The LAPD became synonymous with toughness. For some, this represented safety. For others, it represented occupation. Tension simmered constantly. Each high-profile incident of police violence reopened wounds that had never healed. Trust eroded further. Complaints were ignored. Accountability remained rare. The system protected itself efficiently. By the early 1990s, Los Angeles was a city on edge. Crime rates were high, policing was aggressive, communities were exhausted. The fear that had justified decades of force had not produced peace. It had produced resentment. Then came another spark, when video footage surfaced showing officers beating an unarmed Black man named Rodney King. The city confronted itself again. The images were undeniable. They cut through denial and rhetoric. Los Angeles watched what many had long known, now visible to the world. The verdict that followed would push the city past its breaking point. The empire built on fear had grown powerful, but brittle. And when it cracked, Los Angeles would erupt once more, this time on a scale that would redefine it forever. Chapter 14, 1992. Los Angeles did not erupt suddenly in 1992. It detonated. The explosion had been wired into the city for decades, layered beneath freeways, courtrooms, and television screens. When the verdict came, it did not create anger. It released it. On the afternoon of April 29th, 1992, the city was already tense. News helicopters hovered above neighborhoods. Radios and television stayed on. When the jury announced its decision, acquitting the officers who had been filmed beating Rodney King, something in Los Angeles broke cleanly and completely. There was no confusion about what people had seen. The footage had been replayed endlessly. Batons rising and falling, a body on the ground, authority unrestrained. The verdict told the city that what it had witnessed did not matter. Within an hour, intersections became gathering points. At Florence and Normandy, the city's fault lines crossed visibly. Drivers were pulled from cars. Violence spread outward in waves, not chaotic but directional, moving along routes shaped by history, resentment, and proximity. Sirens echoed, then fell silent as police withdrew. For many residents, that withdrawal was the most shocking moment. The city had not only failed to protect them, it had vanished. As evening fell, fires began to glow across the skyline. Stores were looted, some targeted, others swept up by momentum. Anger blurred into opportunity, then into something darker and more dangerous. The boundaries between protest, revenge, and survival collapsed. Los Angeles became a city without a script. Television carried the images live. America watched as a major city unraveled in real time. Helicopter cameras hovered like detached witnesses, broadcasting flames, beatings, and desperation. The illusion of control, so carefully maintained for generations, dissolved before a national audience. The first night was the most chaotic. Emergency services were overwhelmed, communication broke down. Police presence was uneven and cautious. Entire neighborhoods were left to fend for themselves. Some organized protection, others fled. Fear spread faster than fire. By the second day, the scale of destruction was undeniable. Thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed. Businesses that had survived decades of neglect vanished overnight. Many would never return. The uprising did not strike evenly. It followed the contours of inequality, consuming areas already starved of investment and support. The human cost mounted quickly. People were injured, killed, displaced. Lives already precarious were pushed into free fall. The uprising exposed how thin the line between order and collapse had always been. Authority responded with force. The National Guard arrived, followed by federal troops and Marines. Tanks rolled through streets once defined by neglect. Curfews were imposed. The city reclaimed itself through military presence, not reconciliation. Order returned, but trust did not. As the fires died down, Los Angeles faced the aftermath. The official language emphasized rebuilding, healing, moving forward. Investigations were announced, reforms were promised. But beneath the statements lay a deeper truth. The uprising had not been an anomaly. It had been a reckoning. The city confronted images it could not easily dismiss. Not just the beating of Rodney King, but the abandonment of neighborhoods, the speed of collapse, the depth of rage. Los Angeles had believed that control could substitute for justice. 1992 proved otherwise. Communities were left fractured. Korean-owned businesses, in particular, bore immense losses, caught between systems that neither protected nor acknowledged them. Racial tensions deepened, complicated by misunderstanding and unequal vulnerability. The city's diversity, long celebrated in abstraction, revealed its fragility in crisis. Politically, the moment marked an end and a beginning. The era of unchecked policing faced scrutiny. The LAPD's image was permanently altered. Reforms would come, slowly and incompletely. But the belief in absolute authority was shaken. Culturally, the uprising became a reference point. Music, film, and art absorbed the trauma. Los Angeles began to speak more openly about its violence, its fractures, its contradictions. Silence was no longer plausible. And yet, the city did what it always did. It rebuilt. New developments replaced burned lots. Capital returned selectively. Life resumed its rhythms. Traffic flowed. Hollywood continued filming. From a distance, Los Angeles appeared intact. But something fundamental had shifted. The city could no longer pretend that its problems were hidden or temporary. 1992 was a line in time, a moment after which denial became harder and fear became more complicated. Los Angeles survived the explosion, but it did not escape it. The lessons lingered uneasily, shaping policy, culture, and memory. The question was no longer whether the city could erupt again, but what it would do with the knowledge that it could. As the smoke cleared and the troops withdrew, Los Angeles stood exhausted, exposed, and uncertain. The age of raw confrontation had reached its peak. What followed would not be peace, but transformation. Uneven, incomplete, and driven by new forces that would reshape the city once more. The city had exploded. Now it had to decide how to live with the damage. Chapter 15: Immigration, Culture, and Global Los Angeles. After the fires of 1992 faded and the soldiers left the streets, Los Angeles did what it had always done best. It reinvented itself. Not through apology or collective reckoning, but through movement. People arrived. People stayed. People remade the city quietly, daily, and from the ground up. The old narrative that Los Angeles was defined by black and white, by police and protest, no longer captured what was happening. A different transformation was underway, one driven less by policy and more by migration. While politicians debated reform and headlines searched for closure, millions of new Angelenos were building a global city inside the old one. Immigration reshaped Los Angeles faster and more profoundly than any development plan ever could. People arrived from Mexico, Central America, South America, Korea, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Iran, Armenia, and across the Pacific. Some came fleeing war. Others came chasing opportunity. Many arrived undocumented, invisible to official narratives, but essential to the city's survival. Neighborhoods changed character almost overnight. Spanish became the dominant language in vast parts of the city. Korean signs filled commercial streets. Persian businesses flourished. Entire districts began operating on rhythms tied more closely to Mexico City, Seoul, or Manila than to Washington, D.C. Los Angeles stopped pretending to be merely American. It became something else. This shift was not smooth. Economic inequality remained severe. Housing shortages worsened. Labor exploitation thrived in the shadows. But something fundamental had changed. The city's energy no longer flowed from a single myth or industry. It came from everywhere at once. Culture followed people. Food became the most visible marker of transformation. Taco trucks, once marginalized and policed, became iconic. Korean barbecue, po, pupusas, sushi, and countless hybrid cuisines turned Los Angeles into one of the most diverse food cities on Earth. These were not trends imported from elsewhere. They were local expressions of global lives. Music changed too. Hip-hop, born from the pressure of earlier decades, expanded into new forms shaped by immigrant voices and global influences. Art scenes flourished outside traditional institutions. Murals reclaimed walls once dominated by decay. Storytelling diversified, no longer dependent solely on Hollywood's approval. Hollywood itself adapted, or risked irrelevance. The industry could no longer ignore the city outside its gates. New voices demanded representation. Independent filmmakers challenged studio narratives. The global audience, now fragmented and empowered by technology, expected stories that reflected lived complexity rather than simplified myth. Power shifted unevenly. Some immigrant communities gained economic influence quickly. Others remained trapped in cycles of low-wage labor and legal vulnerability. The city's inequality did not disappear, it diversified. But the old binaries no longer held. Los Angeles became a hub of transnational life. Money flowed across borders. Families existed in multiple countries at once. The city functioned as a relay point in global networks of trade, culture, and labor. It was no longer just exporting images. It was importing the world. Politically, this transformation challenged existing structures. Coalitions shifted. Voting blocs changed. Issues like immigration enforcement, language access, and housing affordability moved to the center of public debate. The city's future could no longer be decided without acknowledging its global reality. Despite this, tension never fully left. Policing remained contested. Gentrification displaced long-standing communities. Freeways still divided neighborhoods. The scars of earlier eras were not erased, they were layered over. But there was resilience in the layering. Los Angeles had learned again how to survive by absorbing difference rather than resisting it outright. Reinvention returned, not as an individual fantasy, but as a collective condition. By the early 21st century, Los Angeles stood as one of the most diverse cities in human history. Its identity was unstable by design. No single narrative could contain it. That instability, once a weakness, became its defining strength. The city no longer needed to sell a single dream. It contained thousands of them, overlapping and competing. Reinvention was no longer something newcomers sought. It was something the city itself embodied. And yet, beneath the vitality, familiar pressures gathered again. Wealth concentrated sharply, housing costs soared, homelessness spread visibly. The old question returned in a new form. Who gets to stay? Los Angeles had survived conquest, collapse, fire, and explosion. It had become global without ever fully resolving its past. The next chapter would not be defined by riot or reinvention alone, but by contradiction, by a city richer and more connected than ever, yet struggling to house, protect, and sustain its own people. The world had arrived in Los Angeles. Now Los Angeles had to face what it had become. Chapter 16. The Modern Metropolis. Los Angeles entered the 21st century without a single moment of arrival. There was no clear break between what it had been and what it was becoming. Instead, the city slid forward, carrying its contradictions openly now, impossible to ignore. The reinvention of the previous decades had succeeded beyond expectation and failed just as spectacularly. Wealth concentrated at the top with stunning speed. Tech money flowed south from Silicon Valley. Entertainment evolved into streaming empires. Real estate became a global investment vehicle rather than a local necessity. Hills filled with glass homes and private security. Luxury towers rose downtown, marketed internationally to buyers who might never live in them. Los Angeles became one of the richest cities on Earth. At the same time, tents spread beneath freeways and along sidewalks. Encampments appeared in places once erased by redevelopment. Homelessness, once hidden or displaced, became unavoidable. Families lived in cars. Seniors slept outside storefronts. Mental illness and addiction played out in public view. The contrast was no longer subtle. It was immediate, visual, and relentless. The city argued with itself daily. Was homelessness a housing problem, a mental health crisis, a moral failure, or an inevitable byproduct of success? Billions were allocated. Programs were launched. Task forces convened. The results lagged far behind the urgency. Every solution collided with bureaucracy, politics, and the sheer scale of the problem. Housing sat at the center of everything. Prices soared beyond the reach of working families. Rent consumed entire paychecks. Home ownership became a fantasy for many who had grown up believing it was a right. Zoning laws preserved exclusivity. New construction lagged behind demand. The city that had once expanded endlessly now found itself constrained by its own rules and resistance. And yet, opportunity still existed, just unevenly distributed. Los Angeles remained a magnet. Creatives arrived chasing influence. Entrepreneurs arrived chasing capital. Immigrants arrived chasing safety. The city still promised reinvention, but the cost of entry had never been higher. Activism flourished alongside apathy. Protests filled streets over police violence, housing injustice, climate change, and inequality. Grassroots organizations worked tirelessly in neighborhoods abandoned by institutions. At the same time, many residents retreated inward, exhausted by traffic, cost, and constant crisis. Engagement competed with burnout. Technology reshaped daily life. Work became mobile. Entertainment became constant. The city felt more connected and more fragmented at once. People lived in the same neighborhoods, but occupied different realities, some buffered by wealth and convenience, others exposed to precarity at every turn. The mythology of Los Angeles adapted again. Social media replaced billboards. Influence replaced fame. The dream was no longer just about success. It was about visibility. Being seen mattered as much as being stable. The city's long relationship with image intensified, accelerating cycles of aspiration and disappointment. Policing evolved, but uneasily. Reforms followed outrage. Outrage followed incidents. Trust remained fragile. The memory of past eruptions lingered beneath every confrontation. Los Angeles had learned that force alone could not maintain order, but it had not fully discovered what could replace it. Climate added another layer of uncertainty. Droughts worsened. Wildfires crept closer. Heat intensified. The city that had cheated geography once again faced limits it could not ignore. Water remained borrowed. Stability remained conditional. And still, people stayed. They stayed because Los Angeles was not just a city. It was a system of possibilities. A place where cultures collided and recombined. Where food told stories of migration. Where languages overlapped in daily conversation. Where identity remained fluid and unfinished. The contradictions did not cancel each other out. They coexisted. Billionaires drove past tents. Activists marched past luxury storefronts. Film premieres occurred blocks from encampments. The city functioned not despite the tension, but within it. Los Angeles no longer tried to hide what it was. The illusion had been replaced by exposure. The question was no longer whether the dream was real. It was who could afford to believe in it. For some, the city delivered everything it promised. For others, it demanded endurance rather than hope. The same streets offered radically different futures, depending on where one started, what one owned, and how visible one's vulnerability was allowed to be. This was the modern metropolis. Global, unequal, vibrant, strained. A city that had survived conquest, collapse, riot, and reinvention, now living inside its own success and failure simultaneously. Los Angeles stood taller than ever, richer than ever, more influential than ever. And yet, it remained restless, unresolved, and uncertain. The dream had survived every transformation, but it had changed shape so many times that its meaning was no longer shared. The final question lingered quietly beneath the noise, traffic, and ambition. What does Los Angeles become next? Chapter 17. The Myth of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has never been finished. That is not a flaw. It is the city's defining condition. From the moment the land was first renamed, redirected, and repurposed, Los Angeles began living in the future rather than the present. Each generation inherited a city already mid-construction, already promised to be something else soon. The city learned early that survival here depended not on permanence, but on motion. What binds Los Angeles together is not architecture, tradition, or even geography. It is expectation. The belief that whatever exists now is temporary, and that something better, bigger, richer, freer, is just ahead. That belief has outlived empires, industries, and identities. It has survived collapse, riot, fire, and reinvention because it is endlessly adaptable. Los Angeles does not ask people to belong. It asks them to arrive. For some, arrival means escape. From poverty, from judgment, from history. The city has always attracted those running toward possibility and away from constraint. For others, arrival means ambition, the chance to rise faster here than anywhere else. For many, it simply means survival. The myth is broad enough to contain all of it. Illusion has never been accidental in Los Angeles. It is structural. The city was built by selling futures before they existed. Railroad towns, citrus empires, movie stardom, suburban bliss, tech wealth. Even the land itself was sold twice, once in reality and once in imagination. Belief filled the gaps where infrastructure, justice, or sustainability lagged behind. Hollywood refined this instinct, but it did not invent it. Long before cameras rolled, Los Angeles learned that stories could move people faster than facts, that hope could outrun scarcity, that promises could substitute for guarantees. The city's most valuable export has never been oil or film or technology. It has been aspiration. This is why Los Angeles absorbs contradiction rather than resolving it. Wealth and poverty coexist because both feed the myth. Success proves the promise. Failure keeps the promise alive. If the dream worked for everyone, it would lose its urgency. If it worked for no one, it would collapse. Its power lies in selective fulfillment. Reinvention here is not optional. It is expected. People change names, accents, careers, identities. Neighborhoods do the same. Nothing is allowed to remain fixed long enough to demand accountability. When the city fails, it does not apologize. It pivots. Growth, then, is not just economic or physical. It is psychological. Los Angeles grows because it must. Stopping would mean confronting limits, and limits threaten the myth. Water shortages are engineered around. Housing crises are managed, not solved. Inequality is acknowledged, then absorbed into the background noise of progress. And yet, despite everything, the city keeps working. It works because people keep building lives within it, even when the structure seems indifferent. Communities form in the margins. Culture emerges where policy fails. Language, food, music, and memory give the city substance where systems provide none. Los Angeles survives because it is constantly remade from below, even as it is sold from above. This tension between image and experience, promise and reality, is not new. It has been present since the first renaming, the first land grant, the first aqueduct. Each chapter of the city's history adds another layer without removing the previous ones. The past is never erased. It is paved over, built upon, and eventually resurfaced. Los Angeles never stops growing because growth is how it avoids conclusion. A finished city would require reckoning. It would require decisions about who belongs, what matters, and where limits lie. Los Angeles postpones those decisions by expanding outward and upward, physically and symbolically. There is always another district, another industry, another reinvention waiting to take shape. This is why the city remains restless, why satisfaction never settles, why the dream is always just out of reach. Los Angeles promises not fulfillment, but pursuit. It does not guarantee arrival. It guarantees movement. For some, that movement leads to extraordinary success. For others, it leads to exhaustion. For many, it leads to both. The city offers no single outcome, only a system that rewards those who can adapt faster than it changes. And it will keep changing. Climate will test it. Economics will reshape it. Technology will fragment it further. New migrations will rewrite its culture again. Old conflicts will resurface in new forms. The city will respond as it always has, not by resolving contradiction, but by absorbing it into the next version of itself. Los Angeles is not a place where history ends. It is a place where history accumulates. That is its danger and its genius. It is a city built on the refusal to be final, to be defined, to be complete. A city that survives by promising more than it can deliver, and delivering just enough to keep the promise alive. Los Angeles does not ask whether it should keep growing. It grows because stopping would mean waking up from the dream. And the city has never learned how to do that.